The wind came down from the mesa like a blade, lifting dust from the frozen yard and driving it under the cabin door. The ranch sat quiet in the hard light. One lean horse in the corral, a stovepipe breathing thin smoke, fence wire singing in little fits where the staples were loose. He'd patched most of them, not all. Some things had to wait. He ate plain and late these days. Coffee boiled too long. A crust of yesterday's bread, hard as oak. He cut it with his pocket knife, set half back on the plate for morning. The quiet held steady. Every sound had a place. The kettle settling, the horse shifting weight, the stove ticking as it thought about cooling. Nothing extra. Then came the knock. Not a man's knock. 3 soft touches, like someone trying not to change the air. He went to the door with the rifle in his hand, the way a man learns out here. He eased the latch and let the cold roll in. A boy stood on the step. Thin, coat too big, no hat, cheeks chapped to raw. He had the high, startled eyes of a stray colt, and a way of holding himself as if he could fold into the wood and disappear. Snow dusted his shoulders, though the sky was clean. He didn't look up at first. He watched the ground. When he spoke, the words came in a torn whisper. "My mother said I must beg, or we'll starve." He said it like a punishment he had been made to carry out. A sentence passed down the line until it reached a pair of small hands. The rancher lowered the rifle. He didn't ask a name. Some things you ask later. He moved aside with one step. The boy stayed outside. He was shaking, not from snow, but from the kind of tired that lives in the bones. "Come in," the rancher said. The boy didn't move his feet. He lifted his eyes instead. Dark, stunned with hunger, a little wild, and then dropped them again as if looking was something he was not allowed to take. The rancher set the rifle in the corner where it leaned every night. He turned to the table, to the plate, to the half slice he had saved. His hand rested on it only a moment. He carried the bread to the door and set it in the boy's hands. No speech, no lesson, just the weight of it, small but real. The boy's fingers closed slow, like he was afraid it would vanish if he was quick. He didn't eat. He held the piece near his chest the way people hold letters. "Is your mother close?" the rancher asked. The boy nodded. "In the draw, we don't want to bother folks." The rancher looked past him at the wide country. The cottonwoods along the dry creek were black against the pale dusk. The road was only ruts and memory. He saw no smoke. "You walk," the rancher said, "or ride?" The boy shook his head. "Walk." "How long?" The boy swallowed. "Since morning, from the siding." "That was 8 miles if you kept the track, more if you strayed." The rancher's eyes went to the corral. One horse, not rich but sound. A blanket on the rail, a saddle he had oiled thin all winter. He poured the boy coffee and cut it with hot water until it was the color of cedar. The boy stood just inside the door, cup clutched in both hands, steam on his face. He didn't speak. He took small swallows like each might be the last good thing for a while. The rancher wrapped the rest of the bread and slid it into the boy's coat pocket. Then he pulled down his old scarf and looped it once around the thin neck. None of it fit. It didn't need to. "Show me," he said. They walked out under a sky turning metal blue. The horse followed at the rope, hooves soft on the hard ground. The boy led, small boots finding the shallow places. They cut away from the road and dropped into the draw where the wind laid off. Willow whips made a dry music. A magpie crossed, slow and low, as if the air had thickened. "Here," the boy said. She was sitting against a cut bank, half hidden by brush. Not old, not young. Wrapped in a blanket to the chin, watching the world with the dry eyes of someone who had gone past fear and into inventory. She saw the horse first, then the man. Only then did her gaze settle on the bread poking from her boy's pocket. "Ma," the boy said, soft, like he was afraid of waking something. She tried to stand. Her legs wouldn't take her. The rancher set the rope over his arm and eased her up by the elbow. She was light in the way that isn't good. The boy slid under her other side. Between them, they made a person out of her again. "Cabin's near," the rancher said. He put her on the horse, blanket and all, and walked, hand at the rope, the boy beside him. No one asked for names. They didn't need them in that stretch of ground between trouble and firelight. By the time they reached the yard, the sky had gone to iron, and the frost was drawing lace on the bucket by the pump. He got her inside, to the chair by the stove. The boy stood, back to the door, as if he'd been set there to hold it shut against the rest of the world. He ladled stew from the pot he had meant to stretch through 2 suppers. He pushed the bowl toward her, then to the boy. They ate quiet, quick, with little breaks to breathe past the ache of food meeting emptiness. He kept his eyes on the stove, on the line where the kettle lid rattled, on the old crack in the hearthstone he had never fixed. He let them eat like people, not beggars. When the bowls were clean, the boy folded his hands. The mother watched the steam fade as if it were a story ending. She lifted her eyes. "We'll go," she said. "We only meant—" "You'll stay," he said. She closed her mouth and opened it again, surprised like someone hearing a word in a language she hadn't known she remembered. The boy looked between them, waiting for the world to choose. "There's a cot," the rancher said. "I'll take the chair." "We can't—" "You can," he said, and not unkind. A small sound came from the boy then. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh. Something made when a body puts down a weight it has carried too far. The mother pressed her palm to her mouth. She nodded once. He brought the basin and set it near the stove, turned his back while she washed road dust from her face with the careful movements of someone who doesn't want to crack. He pulled a quilt from the chest, shook it out, and laid it over the cot. The boy climbed in, still wearing the scarf, eyes already half shut, as if he'd been waiting for permission to sleep. The rancher took the chair by the door. He kept the rifle where his hand could find it, and fed the stove one split at a time, until the metal glowed. The mother lay on her side, facing the fire, eyes open in the orange light. "Thank you," she said at last, voice rough with cold and pride. He tipped his hat where it hung on his knee. "It's a long country," he said. "We shorten it where we can." The clock on the wall, wound too tight years back, made a thin, stubborn sound trying to be a tick. Outside, the fence wire sang once and quit. The horse settled his weight and forgot the day. The boy's breath found a rhythm. The mother's didn't. Not yet. She watched the shadows the way people do when they've learned that trouble comes quieter than thunder. He didn't tell her otherwise. He just stayed. Near midnight, the wind rose again, nosing at the door seam, looking for what lived inside. The rancher stood and shoved a folded rag deeper into the crack. When he sat again, the chair creaked a protest, and then took his shape. He let his eyes close and didn't sleep. He had given them his supper and his fire and his night. It felt less like loss than it should have. In the hollow where hunger had been, something else stood up and looked around. Toward morning, the stove fell to a red hush. He opened his eyes to find the boy staring at him over the quilt, awake without moving, like wild things learn to do. The boy lifted a hand from under the covers and pointed at the door where the first line of day worked itself thin around the frame. "Will we have to go when the light comes?" the boy asked, voice almost not there. The rancher looked at the strip of pale, and then at the two of them, and then at the small world the stove had made. "No," he said. "We'll make the light come here." The boy breathed out, long and careful so it wouldn't break. The mother's eyes finally closed. When the sun found the window, the rancher stood. He set coffee to boil and bread to warm on the stove lid, what little there was. He pulled on his coat and stepped into the white air. The yard lay quiet, rimed and clean, as if the night had washed it. He pumped water till his hands burned from cold. He looked at the fence line and the gate and the hill shouldering up behind the barn and felt the old loneliness loosen like a knot under warm water. He had a horse, a stove, 2 strangers, and a new day asking to be made into something. He put his hand to it the way he put his hand to any hard job, without talk. Behind him, through the door he'd left on the latch, the boy laughed in his sleep. It sounded like a bird that had forgotten winter for a second. The rancher turned toward it before he remembered he couldn't hold such things in his hands. He went back inside instead. By morning the sky had cleared, hard and pale, as if the night storm had never happened. The yard lay stiff with frost. Chickens picked half-heartedly near the shed, leaving prints that would vanish with the first thaw. Jack Whitmore, though no one ever called him by more than the rancher, stood at the pump, filling a tin pail. His breath came out white, curling like smoke. Inside, the boy stirred on the cot, scarf still wrapped around his neck. The woman, his mother, had not yet risen. Her frame stayed curled under the quilt, her hands tucked to her chest. Jack set the pail by the door and watched them for a long moment, hat brim shadowing his eyes. He had lived too many mornings with only his own steps in the cabin. Their quiet breathing felt strange, heavy in the small room. He placed the kettle on the stove and tore the last hunk of bread, setting it near the heat until the crust softened. The smell filled the space, warm, faintly sweet, gone too soon. The boy woke to it, blinking fast, then sitting upright. His eyes darted from the bread to Jack, not daring to reach. Jack slid the plate across the table. The boy's hand hovered, then pulled back. "It's yours," Jack said. His voice was flat but steady, the way he spoke to his horse or to the land. The boy took the piece, biting in small, careful mouthfuls, chewing slow like he feared it might vanish. The mother sat up finally, her face hollow from nights too long without. She tried to refuse when Jack offered the other half of his portion. Her lips pressed tight, but her eyes betrayed the hunger. Jack left the bread on the table between them. He turned to the stove and poured himself coffee, black and thin. By the time he looked back, the bread was gone. Later, he saddled the horse. The boy trailed him outside, hands shoved deep in the sleeves of his coat. "Will you send us away?" he asked, voice muffled by wool and cold. Jack didn't answer. He checked the cinch, adjusted the blanket, then looked down at the boy. His face was all bones and hope, 2 things too sharp for childhood. "No," Jack said at last. The boy let out a breath that fogged the morning. He didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped, lighter. Together they rode to the draw where the woman had been found. She walked slow behind them, steps uncertain, but holding. Jack showed her the spring where water still moved under ice. He cut dry willow for kindling and stacked it on the saddle. The boy carried what he could, tripping once but getting back up without a sound. By dusk they had more wood piled by the cabin than Jack had seen in months. He stood with his hands braced on the porch rail, watching smoke rise steady from his chimney. Inside, 2 voices, light, uncertain, human, broke the silence that had owned this place too long. When he stepped back into the room, The boy was tracing shapes in the frost on the window, and the woman was folding the quilt neat, as if to repay what could not be repaid. Jack set his hat on the peg, pulled out the chair, and sat. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room no longer felt empty. For the first time in years, supper wasn't eaten alone. Snow held through the morning, then bled into mud by noon. The boy found a broom and scraped the porch clean, as if he'd lived there all his life. The woman, he learned her name was Ruth by the way the boy said it when she wasn't listening, stitched the torn hem of her skirt with thread unraveled from a cuff. Jack mended harness in the doorway, needle and rawhide moving in calm, sure strokes. They spoke little. Work said enough. By afternoon, Ruth asked, voice low, if there was a place to wash. Jack showed her the creek bend, where sunlight reached the bank even in winter. He left her a bar of lye soap wrapped in cloth, then walked the boy up the ridge to check fence line. From the crest, the country spread in slow waves. Far off, a black seam stitched the horizon. The wagon road. "Your father come from that way?" Jack asked. The boy's jaw tightened. He nodded once. "Name?" The boy swallowed. "Malachi Hobb." The words came out flat, practiced, like a confession learned by heart. "He keeps what isn't his. He drinks. He hits what's smaller." Jack said nothing. A crow lifted from a cottonwood and sailed the draw, black against pale sky. They patched a weak run by the north pasture, set new staples, stretched wire until it rang. The boy worked quiet, wrists bony inside mitts too big. He flinched when the wire sang. Back at the creek, Ruth had braided her damp hair, the bruise at her temple faded to yellow. Jack saw the way she studied the path to the road without moving toward it. Hunger had carved her down to the bone, but her spine held like seasoned oak. She thanked him for the soap, then took the broom from the boy and sent him to warm his hands. That night, Jack cooked beans with a shred of salt pork he'd saved for spring branding. He watched their faces as the pot simmered, saw the boy's eyes water from the smell and the shame of wanting, saw Ruth sit straighter, like her body needed to remember how to receive what did not hurt. When the food was ready, Jack filled 3 tin bowls equal. He ate slow, measuring each bite against what was left in the sack. When he rose to rinse his dish, he set aside a 4th portion. Modest, wrapped in cloth, tucked on the shelf by the door. Insurance against mourning. Ruth noticed. Her gaze lifted to his, then dropped. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." He wiped the table. "Do it anyhow." Wind prowled the cabin walls after they lay down. Jack fed the stove once at midnight, once before dawn. Between, he listened to the boy's sleep turn from clawed breathing to something that sounded almost like rest. At first light, the tracks showed up. Wagon ruts, not 12 hours old, pressed hard along the road, then angling toward the creek ford. Jack squatted by them, palm above the mud like a blessing he would not give. 2 horses, one lame on the right fore, shoe thrown. He walked back to the porch. Ruth stood in the door with the boy behind her. She already knew. "Your father?" Jack asked. Ruth's mouth thinned. "He follows debt like a dog follows blood." "Does he know you came here?" "He knows I go where bread is." Jack set his hat low. "Then he'll try my gate." "Will you let him?" The question was not a plea. It was a measure. "I'll let the law do its part," Jack said, "if it remembers the trail out this far." She held his eyes. "The law eats at Malachi's table when he has beef to spare." Jack studied the boy. The scarf he'd slept in was knotted tight again. A small armor. "Then we'll count on other things." They readied the place without hurry. Jack moved the mare and the yearlings into the upper pen, closed the sidebar on the corral, slid the gate pin where it wouldn't rattle. He set an extra bucket at the pump and laid out the broken-handled shovel where he could reach it quick. He showed the boy the cellar latch and how to pull it without noise. "Only if I say," Jack told him. The boy nodded. "Only if you say." By noon, the mud at the road had skinned over. The ruts shone dull under cloud. Hoofbeats reached them a minute before the wagon's rattle. Slow, uneven, then angry as the lame horse fought the traces. Malachi Hobb drove standing, long coat flapping like a flag that had seen too many storms. Two men rode beside the wagon, each with the look of folks who traded work for mean favors. They stopped in the yard with more swagger than sense. Malachi grinned without mirth, showing a gold tooth ruined by neglect. "Afternoon," he called. "I believe you've got property of mine." Ruth stepped forward before Jack could speak. "I'm not your property." "That so?" Malachi's eyes slid to the boy. "And him? Ain't no court says a son ain't his father's, last I heard." Jack came down the steps, easy, hands empty. "Court's far from here," he said. "Closer is a man's door, and my door says you'll speak soft." One of the riders chuckled. Malachi didn't. He studied Jack the way a trader studies a hide, judging weight, wear, value. "Look at you," Malachi said. "Mud on your boots and manners in your mouth. You think you can stand between me and what's mine?" "No," Jack said. "I'll stand between you and who isn't." The rider on the left shifted in his saddle. "We ain't come to jaw," he said. "Then don't," Jack replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Ruth took the boy's hand without looking. The boy didn't pull away. Malachi flicked the reins, inching the wagon closer, wheels crunching frost. "I'll make it simple," he said. "Woman and child in the wagon. You get coin for your kindness. Good deed settled, or—" His gaze went flat. "We take what's owed with interest." Jack felt the old weight settle in his chest, the same weight he'd carried through a winter when a fever had taken the only laughter his house had known. He set his boot heels firm on the packed ground. "No," he said again. Silence held for a heartbeat, two, then cracked. The rider on the right nudged his horse towards the porch. Jack took one step forward and lifted the broken-handled shovel. He didn't brandish it like a weapon. He let it rest across his shoulders, balanced, easy. "Your horse is lame," he said to Malachi, chin tipping toward the off-fore. "Throwing that shoe got you here slower than you wanted. You woke mad and you'll leave madder. But you will leave." The rider laughed, but he didn't come closer. Ruth's voice came quiet from behind Jack. "Malachi." He looked at her, waiting for a plea. She gave none. "If you ever wondered whether I'd beg," she said, "here I am, not begging." Color rose behind Malachi's beard. He spat into the mud, a short, ugly sound. Jack stepped down into the yard, closing the space by inches. He kept his hands loose. He kept his eyes level. "You can turn your wagon now," he said, "or you can test the ground." He glanced at the corral. "It'll hold either way." A gust ran through the cottonwoods and rattled dead leaves that had clung all winter. The sound was like distant applause, or bones in a box, hard to tell. Malachi's gaze slid to the boy. "You tell this stranger who feeds you," he barked. "You tell him what your name buys you when you go back to my camp." The boy studied the wagon tire. He didn't answer. His scarf had loosened at the edge. He tucked it closer, small hands careful. Malachi jerked the reins as if to lunge the wagon forward. The lame horse planted and blew hard, unwilling. The ridiculousness of it leaked the threat out of the scene like wind out of a stove seam. One rider cursed under his breath. Jack said nothing. He waited. Anger needs an audience. Denied applause, it trips over itself. Malachi swore, then snapped the reins again, this time in a tight circle. The horses turned slow, wagon creaking. He leaned out as he passed Jack, the gold tooth mean in the gray light. "This ain't done," he said. "It is for today," Jack answered. The wagon rattled back to the road. The riders followed, throwing looks over their shoulders that promised a second act. When the dust settled, the yard felt too quiet. Ruth's knees buckled, not far, just enough that the step caught her. Jack set the shovel down and stood beside her without touching. The boy reached first, thin arm around her waist. Jack watched the road a long time. He knew a retreat when he saw one. He also knew a man like Malachi valued pride more than horseshoes. He'd come again, with a sounder plan and a fresh shoe nailed to spite. "Cellar latch," Jack said softly to the boy. "Let me hear you pull it once." The boy did. The hidden pin clicked like a promise. Ruth straightened. The color had returned to her face, not much, just enough to put a line of light back in her eyes. She looked at Jack, as if to say, "Thank you, and I'm sorry, and I'll work for this roof all at once." He tipped his hat, as if to say, "You already are." They ate thin stew that night. Jack added more water than meat and let it boil long. He split the last biscuit into 3 careful quarters and left the smallest on his own plate. The boy pretended not to notice. Ruth didn't pretend. She slid a spoonful back into Jack's bowl when he wasn't looking. He let it sit there, then ate it without comment. After, when the cabin darkened to lamplight, Ruth stood by the window and watched the road. Jack sat by the stove and oiled his saddle skirting until the leather shone. "Will he come in the night?" she asked. Jack set the cloth down. "He'll come when he thinks I'm tired." "And are you?" "Yes," Jack said. He rose, set another stick on the fire, and checked the rifle by the door. "But I know how to be tired standing up." The boy fell asleep with his boots on. Ruth tucked a blanket around him, and then, after a moment's thought, tucked one around Jack's shoulders where he'd sat back down in the chair. Outside, a thin moon climbed, pale as a scar. The road lay quiet, hiding its plans in ruts and shadow. Jack eased the window open a finger's width and let the cold bite his cheek. He listened to the country breathing. He could almost hear the shape of trouble turning back toward them. Hooves newly shod, pride newly stoked. He closed the window and set the latch careful. "All right," he said to the room, to the stove, to the 2 shapes sleeping under his roof. "Let it come." And when it did, he would be ready. Not with speeches, not with rage, but with the same stubborn, ordinary courage that puts bread on a table and keeps the door from swinging in the wind. The storm broke 3 days later. Wind carried grit sharp as nails, driving dust into eyes and teeth. The boy helped Jack tie down the shutters, his thin arms trembling with each knot. But he did not quit. Ruth brought in the last of the laundry, stiff from freezing, her hair whipped loose by the gale. Inside, the house was dim and close. The last sack of flour sat half empty. Beans rattled in the bottom of a tin. Jack counted quietly, lips moving, and came to the same number each time. Not enough. At sundown, the wind shifted, and the sound of hooves pushed through the storm. Ruth stiffened at the window. The boy's face went white. Jack lifted the rifle from the wall, but did not raise it. Yet. A figure staggered into view, wrapped in rags that barely held together. Not Malachi, not the riders. Smaller. A girl, no older than 17, her skin streaked with dust, her arms clutching a bundle wrapped in a coat. She reached the porch, nearly collapsed, and rasped against the door. "Bread, please. Take the child. Just give me bread." The words cut clean through the storm. Ruth flinched as if struck. Jack opened the door. The girl stumbled inside, the bundle pressed tight to her chest. She unwrapped it with shaking hands, and a baby blinked up at the lamplight, face hollow with hunger. Ruth covered her mouth. The boy froze, eyes wide. Jack set the rifle back on its peg and closed the door against the storm. "You've come a long way," he said. The girl swayed, clutching the child. "I can't feed her. I can't. I'll trade her for bread. Just bread." The words were flat, rehearsed, the kind you say after you've spoken them 100 times to yourself in the dark. Jack's jaw tightened. He crossed the room, took the bundle gently, felt how light the baby was. The girl's arms fell as if broken. He didn't speak right away. He set the baby against his chest, the tiny head beneath his beard, and then moved to the shelf. The cloth-wrapped portion he had been saving sat there, the last biscuit, hard but whole. He placed it on the table. Ruth reached for it, then stopped. Jack slid it across the wood toward the girl. She stared at it, then at him. Her lips cracked as she whispered, "You'll keep her?" Jack said nothing. He only pushed the biscuit closer. The girl snatched it, tore it with her teeth, and chewed like someone afraid it would vanish before she could swallow. Crumbs fell, and she licked them from her fingers. When it was gone, she sank against the table, eyes closed, chest rising too fast. The baby whimpered. Jack shifted his hold, slow, steady, until the sound quieted. Ruth touched the girl's shoulder, not unkind. "Rest. No one's taking anything from you tonight." The girl shivered, then broke into sobs so raw they rattled the cabin walls more than the storm outside. The boy backed toward the corner, scarf in his hands. He watched the scene as though memorizing it, learning what kind of man Jack was, and what kind he himself might grow to be. Jack stood silent, the child against him, the storm beating the shutters, and 3 lives now under his roof, where once there had been none. And he thought, there is never enough bread, but there can be enough hands. Morning came pale and thin. The storm had passed, leaving the yard littered with branches and drifts of dust against the fence. Inside, the cabin smelled of smoke and boiled beans, stretched thin with water, but still warm in the belly. The girl slept by the stove, curled tight on a pallet Ruth had made. The baby lay beside her, wrapped in an old quilt Jack hadn't touched since his wife died. The boy sat near, tracing lines in the ashes with a stick, his eyes darting between them as though to make sure they hadn't vanished in the night. Jack stepped outside, hat low, and looked at the land. His land. Frost bit the grass, and the corral fence sagged where the storm had torn it. Work pressed heavy on his shoulders. For years he had carried it alone. Now, inside his cabin, there were 4 mouths besides his. He returned to the doorway. Ruth was awake, watching him. No words passed between them, but something softer moved in her face. A question? A warning? Maybe even trust? Jack set his rifle back on the wall and spoke at last. "She stays. Both of them." Ruth's eyes filled, but she nodded. The boy let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. The girl stirred, blinking against the light. Her voice cracked. "Why? I gave her up." Jack crouched by the stove, his rough hands steady as he poured her coffee. "You begged for bread," he said. "I gave it. Now I take both. That's the trade." Her lips trembled. She looked at the baby, then at him, and shook her head as tears slid down her cheeks. "You don't know what you're doing." Jack didn't answer. He stood, lifted the baby into his arms again, and held her as if the weight of her small body was the only truth that mattered. The girl broke, burying her face in her hands, sobbing in a way that shook the walls harder than the storm ever had. Ruth moved to her side, arms wrapping around shoulders thin as sticks. The boy edged closer, scarf dangling from his hands, until he touched the baby's tiny fingers with a reverence that silenced even his own fear. Jack looked at all of them, the broken, the hungry, the lost, and felt something shift inside. Not pity, not burden, something steadier. For years, his cabin had been a coffin of silence. Now it was crowded, messy, alive. The baby stirred, whimpering. Jack pressed her closer to his chest, his voice a low rumble she could not yet understand. "You're home." Outside, the land waited. Fences to mend, soil to turn, cattle to feed. Hardship would never leave. Hunger would always stalk the edges. But inside, for the first time in a decade, Jack Whitmore did not feel alone. He had given away his last bread, and somehow he had taken more than enough in return.